Being a beginner can be a struggle, or it was at least a struggle for me, because there's so many buttons, so many settings, so many potential sources for errors. And the smallest mistake can easily lead to a soft, blurry, or a generally bad photo. And in today's video, I want to introduce you to 3 mistakes that I have made as a beginner, and I will show you how to fix them so that you do not have to make them in the first place. And if you stay tuned till the end, I will give you a bonus tip on how you can turn an alleged mistake into a creative piece of art. So let's get into it. The first mistake is a bit of a funny one because now in hindsight, I see where it's coming from. And if you have watched any beginners tutorials, they usually tell you that if you want to have everything in focus, you stop down your lens. So your aperture value should be a smaller value so that you have everything in focus. So what beginners tend to do is that they're gonna stop down their aperture all the way to f16 or even f22. And what beginners of course don't know is that shooting at f16 or f22 has a set of downsides. The first downside is that you introduce something called diffraction, which will lead to a generally softer image. So while paradoxically you should have everything in focus, the detail sharpness of what is in focus will actually be worse. So what effectively happens when you stop down to f22 is that your aperture, which is a big hole in the end, will become smaller and smaller. And as this hole becomes smaller, the light waves that enter your sensor interfere with each other, which will lead to this generally softer image. And independent from this loss of sharpness, there is a second issue of shooting at f16 or f22, which is that since your aperture hole is so small, there is also little light that will hit your sensor. In other words, it could be that there is not enough light in your scene and your camera has to counteract that to properly expose your scene by raising the ISO in processing. So in other words, you might not only end up with a soft photo due to diffraction, but you might also end up with a photo that is noisy because there is not enough light entering your aperture and hitting the sensor. So how are we gonna fix this issue? Well, on a wide-angle lens, it's usually already enough to stop down to f5.6 and have basically already everything in focus. Additionally, if you shoot at f5.6, you have reached something which is usually called the sweet spot of your lens, or where your lens is the sharpest, giving you the best resolution possible. If you shoot on a 50mm and beyond lens, it might be required to stop down to f8 or even f11 to get everything in focus. In other words, it depends a bit on the scene, but generally speaking, you do not need to stop down beyond f11, where diffraction usually tends to kick in, because your image is in fact most of the time already properly in focus, even at f5.6 to f11. So in the previous point, we were talking about aperture and how a very stop-down aperture can actually ruin your photos. In the next point, we do the exact opposite, which is that if you shoot everything wide open, it can actually ruin your photos. And first of all, don't get me wrong, there is good reasons to shoot wide open. First of all, it's an incredible experience to see how everything in the background becomes fully blurry and it's just your subject that's really standing out of the blur. And while I think that every beginner should have this wow effect and this blurry background that looks very magical, very professional, there is again a set of issues related to shooting your aperture wide open at f1.4 or even f1.2 for instance. First of all, when you shoot wide open, this is usually where your lens is the softest. And as you stop down your lens to f2, f2.8, f4, your lens usually improves until this point of diffraction is reached that we introduced in the previous point. So in other words, if you want to have the absolutely crispest photos and the finest detail in your photo, then you might consider to stop down a stop or two. So let's say, for instance, your maximum aperture is f2, then you might stop down to f4 to really get the most crispy results and the best detail possible. So the next reason why shooting wide open might be problematic is that you lose valuable context in your scene. And to build up on that, you also tend to disregard composition because your entire composition is just built on background blur. So the only thing you care about is your subject, and everything that's in the background will not be that important anyway because it's going to be blurry anyway. But when you stop down a stop or two, you first of all introduce much more context in your scene because not everything in your background becomes a blurry mess. Additionally, by stopping down, you also get a sense of composition and how different elements in your scene interact with each other and how you can use them to have a balanced and nice to look at composition, which is not necessarily the case if you shoot everything wide open, where again, your entire composition is just built on blur, which keeps the entire scene a bit more distant, lacking context, and, as mentioned in the previous point, possibly also sharpness. An additional issue of shooting wide open is that wide open means that much more light is actually hitting your sensor, and your camera uses the shutter speed to control the light that enters the sensor and to properly expose the scene. And most cameras sadly have limitations when it comes to shutter speeds. So you can, for instance, not exceed a shutter speed of 1/8000th of a second in mechanical shutter speed, and some cameras do not even go further than 1/8000th of a second in electronic shutter speed. In other words, it could be that the camera you own might not even be able to block off the amount of light that is received by the sensor, and you're gonna have an image that's completely overexposed. So how do you know that you have exceeded your maximum shutter speed to properly expose your photo? Well, usually your camera gives you the shutter speed value in red. So it basically gives you a warning that it would require a higher shutter speed to properly expose the scene, which your camera physically cannot go to. And while some cameras these days have really capable electronic shutters that are usually able to read out faster or to go to even higher shutter speeds, they also come with their own set of disadvantages, most notably that you use dynamic range or a little bit of flexibility to edit your photos in post. And additionally, you can also have issues with rolling shutter, where everything that's moving in your frame might look a bit skewed due to the sensor not being able to read out fast enough. Let's talk about blurry photos next, and there are several reasons why you might encounter blurry photos, such as autofocus related issues, but the large majority of my blurry photos is actually related to using the wrong shutter speed, and more specifically to use a shutter speed that's in fact too slow. A first issue that you might encounter related to too slow shutter speeds is called motion blur. And motion blur is effectively when your frame is steady, but everything that is moving in your photo appears slightly blurry. Another issue you might encounter is that your shutter speed is so slow that every minimal camera shake that you might introduce through your hand not being fully steady will result in a blurry photo, independent on whether your subject is moving or not. So how are we fixing a too slow shutter speed? Well, we do so by having a shutter that's sufficiently high to freeze your action, but also to keep your frame nice and steady. So if you want to keep your frame nice and steady and you have, let's say, a subject that's moving relatively slowly, it might be enough to have a shutter speed of 1 over your focal length. So in this case, for instance, I have a 35mm full frame equivalent lens. So 1 over 35mm would be enough as a shutter speed to keep the frame nice and steady. However, if you have a faster moving subject, such as a bike or a car, for instance, it might not be enough to use this formula over 1 over the focal length. And in that case, you have to use a different formula, which is 1 over 2 times your focal length. So in this case, 35mm, it will be 1 over 2 times 35mm, equaling at 1/70th of a second. Sometimes you might have to make your shutter speed even faster because your subject is really moving quickly. So use these formulas as a guideline and adapt them as required. Because if you have a stabilized camera and your scene is fully static, you might go even below this 1 over the focal length rule. And if you have a subject that's moving super fast, your 1 over 2 times rule might actually not be enough, and you need a shutter speed that's even higher than 1/70th of a second, let's say 1/250th of a second, to make sure that your subject is nice and crisp despite being fast. And since you have stayed till the end of the video, I will actually give you a bonus tip on how you can use slow shutter speeds to your advantage to create something intentional and truly special. For instance, you can use the shutter drag effect, where you use a low shutter speed like 1/15th of a second, and you track a subject and you pan with it. So you follow the subject around and you try to match the speed of the subject. And what you will see is that your subject will stay relatively sharp, Well, every light in the background will create these lovely light trails, which can make for a really nice effect. Alternatively, you can use a low shutter speed to deliberately use motion blur to your advantage and create a photo that's overly more dynamic. Is there any other beginner's mistakes that I might have missed? Let me know in the comment section below. And with that being said, thank you so much for tuning in today, and I hopefully see you in next week's video. Bye.